Okay, this screencast is primarily for the AM class. We missed a lot of time with all the power outages and technology issues and glitches. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but I did want to share, as promised, with you just a quick overview of the motor development lecture that I don't feel like we had a whole lot of time to dive into on Thursday morning. So you can take a few moments to listen to this. If you choose not to and just read the notes, it's not a problem. You're not missing anything. But I do realize that there are different learners, and I want to be able to offer to you all what I offered to the PM class. So basically what I want you to know about motor development is that it continues to evolve throughout the lifespan, depending on the muscular skeletal changes that occur, the experiences that people have. Life and motor development end up being cyclic. It's something that happens over a lifespan, and it's multidimensional. It has several entities that are involved in this movement, and also it's kind of plastic. So what that means is that it's pliable, it is flexible. We talked a lot about that yesterday morning for in some other areas, but development is flexible, right? But it also develops in this continuum across a person's lifespan. So we have to consider and take into account when we're looking at our babies that they most of the time have limited experiences. And so their motor development will be skewed in some ways, especially if we're talking about an infant who is premature, has had to primarily lay on their backs for 18 months of their life, or even 6 or 7 months of their lives. Those first months are so critical in a child developing typically that often our premature babies do not get those experiences. So for example, tummy time, exposing them to just being in prone for long periods of time helps to develop this counterbalance so that their muscles can grow evenly, if you will, and develop evenly. And our kids that are chronically ill or seriously ill at birth don't have those same experiences. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we are still looking at typically developing children even into next week, but we will quickly move into atypical development. And so I want you to have a broad perspective of what normal, quote unquote, normal looks like, so that as we move into abnormal or atypical, I hate to use abnormal, you will have a better appreciation of that. So the periods are listed here. That's not something that you need to necessarily know for testing purposes, but just know that they're of course, there are different stages: infancy, childhood, adolescence, and then adulthood. And in these periods, different stages of development occur quite naturally. Everything is cyclic and should happen in a proper progression. Then we move into older adulthood when we see this kind of where we're still growing, but because our other systems are beginning to shut down, we kind of have this reverse experience. So that's what I mean by what I'm saying is that it's cyclic. I'm always interested in Benjamin Buttons and wishing sometimes that life presented a lot like him. He came to this world as an older person and got younger as he aged. It was just interesting, an interesting dynamic to think about. We talked a lot about cognition and motivation in the PM class, and I just want you to be mindful of that these two factors do make a difference in how a child grows and develops. So their cognitive level, children are motivated by toys and motivated by being with their families and being loved, and they move and thrive because of that. But if their cognitive levels don't give them the ability to even understand or to be inquisitive, then often these children develop at slower rates. Also, motivation is a big factor. I mean, play is huge for our children. That's how they learn. That's a term that I use quite often. Children learn when they move. And when our babies don't have that motivation or cannot move or don't have the cognitive level to move, we start seeing some of these problems or delays in motor development. So just keep that in mind. It's not a yes, in and of itself, motor development should occur quite naturally, but there are certainly some external factors that impact it. So here are the Lysan's Piaget. I'm sure you may have heard this somewhere in your psychology classes. I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to read over that because I just want you to be aware that there are different theories out there about how we develop and grow. So let's move on down here. Let's stop here and talk a little bit about theories of motor development. So in years past, we really had this thought that the hierarchical model of motor development was the way that we learned. So we mentioned a little bit in class about how our reflexes are brainstem movements, and then as we voluntarily learn how to move, some of the higher brain centers take over, and so these movements don't necessarily go away, they integrate. And so that has been the premise of how we thought we learned how to move. We had these reflexes, our bodies learned how to move off of these reflexes, and then we got more and more experience where we did not have to use the reflexes anymore. Well, we've since realized that there is a more modern approach to this thought. The dynamical or dynamic systems theory takes into consideration all these other factors: sensory awareness, motivation, cognition. All of these things play a role in how a child moves. And so those are the differences. That's a general difference between those two theories. And the bottom line is we still really don't know which is the more appropriate way to think about movement. I personally feel like it is a combination of the two. I certainly feel like children do learn how to move reflexively initially, but I also feel like they are certainly impacted by their environment and by their exposure as well. I have seen and know of plenty of children who were not placed down on the floor. We talked a little bit about that in class, but I even have an example of a girlfriend of mine who lives here right in Chicago, the Chicago area, and her child was 9 months old and she was not crawling. And the first question I asked her was, "What does she do when you put her on the floor?" And she politely said, "I don't put my baby on the floor." And I said, "Well, quite frankly, how do you think that she's going to learn how to move?" "Well, I put her on the bed. That's a flat surface." Yes, but the bed is a soft surface. And so children are not able to push back. They don't get proprioception through their joints like they would on a flatter, firmer surface. And so it was almost like within days that this little girl started crawling. So just, things like that people don't take into consideration that we have to think about. Neuroplasticity, I think you all are well aware of that. Older theories thought that our brain did not change. It was hardwired by the time a child was 7, and that a child did not have, or a person did not have the ability to change much after that. And we've since found that that is untrue. We see that in stroke patients all the time, where they lose or have some hemiparesis in one side, and they go right back to those brainstem movements to learn how to move. So we certainly know that our brain can configure and do what it needs to do. Brain is awesome. Developmental concepts. Now, these are some things. Epigenesis is just the ability for the human body to adapt to change. And that's not as important to me, but I do want you to be familiar with these terms. So we talked about it. From now on in class, or even anywhere you are, you always want to name what's going on with a person's entire body. You want to look at them globally. And so we're not just treating a shoulder, we're not just treating an elbow, we're not just treating a knee or a lower extremity. We want to look at the person holistically. And when we talk about movement, we want to always talk about movement being from head to toe. So you want to look at the person and its full being. And you always want to know that that's how movement develops. A child gains head control, trunk control, then they gain extremity control. Then they have more controlled mobility and a skill in something. But they have to gain this proximal control before they can move out into other entities. All right. Proximal to distal, I just talked about that. And I was pronouncing dissociation incorrectly. Like I said, disassociation, it is dissociation. So pardon me for that error as I went back and realize what I was saying to you. The correct spelling, or not spelling, but pronunciation, is dissociation. But again, that is the ability for the body to separate one part from the other. And this is important for us because if you think about the newborn baby that we looked at, their body moves very holistically, right? They are in asymmetry, but their body is constantly moving at the same time. And it is not until a child learns how to dissociate his head from his neck or head from his trunk that we get some true functional movement. Let's move on down. Those terms are there for you, not something that I'm super interested in you knowing. I am pulling out the things that are important to me. So just again, remember that when a baby is born, they are in physiologic flexion just because of the position in their mother's womb. And they learn how to move into extension against gravity, and then they get this balance eventually, and they learn how to flex. So that is what is important when we think about our children. Those bullet points are important there. I want you to read through those as well. Developmental process. Terminology that's in your text is pretty straightforward, but let's land here for the last few moments of this screencast. This is probably your Bible, if I would say, in terms of motor milestones. Motor milestones are consistent across culture, across gender. These milestones a child should hit at about the ranges that are listed here. Again, I think I mentioned in class, if you look at 3 or 4 texts next to one another, you will see that the ranges are different. I will give you the specific ranges that I would like you to know for testing purposes, but please understand that these are just ranges. Some children develop more quickly, some develop more slowly. We don't have concerns about these ranges unless they're way out of the ballpark. So no head control. Milestone, 4 months. You need to know that this child then moves from this asymmetric patterning. Their head is always to one side or the other, and they're able to gain some control over their head. Know the difference between log rolling and segmental rolling. Okay, log rolling occurs first, quite naturally, because a baby can take its big head as soon as it turns. More than likely, because of the counterbalance, the head should follow, but there's no rotation noted at the trunk. The more mature type of rolling, segmental rolling, occurs a little bit later at 6 to 8 months. But what's cool about all of this is that it's happening at the same time, because now not only is a child able to roll, but also a child is able to get into, not able to get into, but can be placed in a sitting or a ring sitting position and be able to independently stay there. Okay. So they've learned how to get some segmental rolling in a dependent place, right? And so now we move to this sitting, and they have to go back to kind of this static position. And then as they get a little bit older, they're learning how to dissociate their body or their trunk and get some counter rotation. So they are able to sit by themselves at 6 months. And then when we think about 7 to 8 months, they're able to start some rotation to get down into a position of quadruped or quadruple, and then come back onto sitting. And so that quite nicely leads us into creeping. So creeping, the classic time for creeping is about 8.5 months. Children are super great crawlers by 9 months and are starting to pull to stand and cruise at 10 to 11 months. Okay, walking is a great milestone for most parents. That's what they want to see happening. The traditional range is listed there, 12 to 18 months. And again, I am not super concerned about children having difficulty with this unless I'm not seeing signs during this range. You see that there are also some differences in gait or when it occurs based on culture. Take that lightly because, again, it could happen to be exposure. All right, I am going to stop right there and start another cast. Sorry, it's going to take so long, but it only gives me 15 minutes at a time. All righty.